I'm your host, Scott Norton, and welcome to At Large. On this show, I talk to world-class creatives who use business to bring their ideas to life. We'll hear about their creative practices, their most interesting stories, and the lessons that'll inspire you the way that they've inspired me. Every time we do a show with a filmmaker, I'm reminded how much I love movies. Today's guest is director Daniel Goldhaber, who blends high-tension genre films with piercing social commentary. His 2018 feature, Cam, a provocative psychological thriller about a camgirl's stolen identity, marked him as a director unafraid to dig deep into the darker recesses of contemporary culture. But if Cam was Goldhaber's statement of intent, his 2022 feature, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, solidified his place as a filmmaker with something to say. Boldly political yet tightly constructed, Pipeline is further proof that Goldhaber is mastering the art of genre with a conscience, a rarity in the landscape of popular cinema, often content with spectacle over substance. Daniel's films and Daniel's life explore the tension between capitalism and activism, between creativity and the imperative of commerce. In this conversation, you'll hear about the best parts of his film education at Harvard, how he crashed a party at Cannes to get his movie financed, and how a weekend raving in Berlin changed the course of his life forever. Call him a raconteur, a provocateur, but just don't call him an auteur. Either way, I have a feeling that Daniel's career as a filmmaker is just getting started. So whether you're listening to this conversation in 2024 or doing retrospective research in 2034, please enjoy my conversation with Daniel Goldhaber. I'd love to talk about your early journey from loving film to making film for a living. Like, how did you discover film, and how did you kind of make the transition to working on a feature?
I got bit by the film bug when I was probably, 10 or 11. I think the way that people used to, which was, I kind of met a guy at a video rental store who started recommending weird stuff to me. And I was quite socially isolated growing up, and movies were very much kind of my portal into a larger world, that I couldn't really access. And I started thinking about working in movies, and I just became pretty obsessed with the idea of making it happen, and went to Harvard for film. And, Harvard for me was a very challenging place, just was not, I didn't really grow up around money or power. And that's a lot of what that school is about, but the film department there is quite remarkable, and the professors there are really amazing, and they teach film in a way that's very different from, I think, most of the other pedagogies that I'm aware of in the US. It's a program that's really focused on documentary filmmaking, and really on kind of this very, very basic idea of what is an image? How do you capture an image? Why do you capture an image? And how do you work with other people to capture images? And this is not really what we think about when we think about filmmaking. We think about there is the director, and they are the visionary artist, and they then tell everybody else what to do. And I think that is fundamentally an industrial process of making movies. That's not necessarily the way that a movie has to be made, or how we have to conceptualize it. We place such a premium on this idea that whoever is in a position of leadership, that is what matters, is because they exist in a particular place on the hierarchy. And that if you're there, your word is God, and everybody has to kind of follow it. And this notion of leadership as kind of communication and consensus building, that was drilled into me at a very young age. That, and especially in the context of filmmaking, that if you're going to get your ideas across, you don't just get to do that because you're the director. So I basically left school. I made one short. It went nowhere. It played one film festival. But eventually, I just was broke and struggling and really stuck for a few years. And then, I'd gotten a job writing a script for somebody. It's kind of based off of a family story that he had. And I saved up some money doing that. And I had a bit of a financial runway to go and try to make something. And I had the idea of Cam as a film, and kind of reached out to Issa and was would you want to go do this? And she was really excited about it. And we basically I had 9 months. I think that part of the thing with Cam was that we knew, and for those that aren't familiar, it's a movie that's based on Issa's experiences as a cam girl. So she had worked as a cam girl, had hired me to shoot promotional porn videos for her. And she was really at the very, very forefront of this kind of sex worker positivity movement that became much more mainstream. And now, you know, with like Honora in theaters, which is like tipped to win Best Picture.
Wow.
Like there's been an arc, but you know, in 2015 when she started, this was not like, you would never have seen like a movie like Honora in the mainstream the way that we do right now. And so I think that we were really excited. You know, I was really excited by just kind of this like approach that she had to being a sex worker, which was that, you know, this was like her creative like outlet. And basically, we wanted to build a film that was kind of constructed around the idea of a sex worker who, you know, had agency, and that what happens when that agency is taken away from her. But then the fundamental idea being like she has agency at the beginning of the film, and then also a film that would kind of really bring you into a sex worker's like psychological mindset. And so we kind of came up with this idea of a surreal psychological thriller. And all of these pieces at the time, you know, it was like shortly after It Follows had just, you know, and The Witch, and this kind of idea of like more elevated, intelligent horror. Get Out. When we went and pitched Blumhouse, they'd just seen the first cut of Get Out. We're really excited by what that could be. But I think that we were very aware that like this is a world where like this is an idea that we know people will talk about, and we can kind of sell that. And we feel that, you know, there's a genre element here that can also get the movie made. And so, you know, I had gone to Sundance in 2016 just on my own dime and just started pitching the movie, which is how I got my first two films made, was going to film festivals and just talking to anybody about them, and then seeing people would be like, oh, well, that's really interesting, you know, which is something else that I think is like for other filmmakers, a big lesson, which I think a lot of filmmakers are like, oh, I don't want to go to a film festival unless I have a film there, or unless I'm invited, or unless, you know, I matter enough. And it's like, there's a film community. That's a conference, you know, you don't need to kind of be invited to have extraordinary utility for you. And so, yeah. And then we wrote, you know, I got a lot of feedback about the project and understood what people were excited about by it. We wrote the script and just like, I sent it to everybody I knew. And, you know, we just kind of kept pounding the pavement. And eventually Blumhouse just, you know, put their hand up and said, we really want to do this. And gave us the money, and we got to go kind of do exactly what we wanted. It ended up on Netflix, and it did really, really, really well on the platform.
It did. Okay.
Yeah.
And so Netflix ended up basically being you call it backstop, or like the sort of the default buyer in a way. And it went to Netflix, and then it performed really well. Yeah.
Well, what happened is it was originally purchased under just like a simple output deal. So it was just going to kind of go on the platform and likely more or less disappear because it was not bought for like a large amount of money.
Right.
But then we managed to kind of get a foothold with a festival premiere at Fantasia and got exceptional reviews. And, you know, Jason Blum literally like, you know, just kind of sent one of the reviews to Scott Stuber at Netflix and was like, where's the cam love? And they upgraded us to a Netflix original after the fact.
Oh, wow.
So we actually get the movie back.
To get you more promotion.
Exactly.
And more visibility.
And also for them, they were all of a sudden able to kind of be like, hey, look, we have another kind of, you know, elevated, you know, critically acclaimed horror film. Because I think that we were like one of the, 10, 20 best reviewed horror movies of the decade.
Wow.
You know,
it's
so
interesting
like,
that you call it horror, because I guess one might call it thriller, but I guess it is horror because there is arguably a supernatural element, or
I would call it a thriller.
Undefined force.
Other people call it horror. I think this is also part of what happened in the 2010s is like the genre category of horror was really just like opened up to really encompass thriller with even any sort of supernatural element to it.
Yes.
But I think a lot of that is just marketing, and a lot of that is like a way to kind of like shortcut communication to audiences that like are like,
right.
Yeah.
Or if Netflix is saying, we're buying horror, great, I got a horror film for you. You know, it's a rom-com, but, you know, there's some supernatural thriller elements to it. And then,
exactly.
And as you're speaking, I mean, I'm connecting so many dots from both your childhood when you talk about hierarchy and power, and then also how at Harvard you learned, quote unquote, like filmmaking, or, you know, the craft of film, but without necessarily the brigade system, we'll call it.
Because like this is still fundamentally the methodology of filmmaking that's taught, and that is kind of like recognized when it comes to like the way that we make a conventional narrative feature film, you have to like actively build a system that reduces your power as director and that shares that power actively with other people. And, you know, again, like I'm still very much the director of the movies, but I have a system of collaboration that grew out of this process with Issa, where basically like we, for the first year-ish on the movie, just would get into like pretty intense fights about the film, about the script, about where we wanted the story to go. And it would become this like, you know, I want it this way, I want it that way. And we'd try to like kind of fight the other one into, you know, kind of accepting our, and that was not a sustainable practice. And so eventually we actually had a couples counselor, partially because we had used to date, and we're also like working through a lot of personal stuff at the time.
Yeah.
And we kind of like through this process of this couples therapist that we were working with, she kind of got us to this place where it was like, you know what? The only way that this collaboration will be functional is if it's really that like, if I have an idea and you don't like it, or you have an idea that I don't like, it's a dead idea, because we're in a collaboration. There has to just be kind of a mutual agreement, and ultimately,
no veto. You both have to be able to turn the key on major decisions.
And then ultimately, what we started realizing was that, well, yeah, if you have something that I don't like, and we work it out, we really hammer it until it's something that we both really like, that is a better idea almost always.
Absolutely.
And so without getting to this place of like, once you just got, I like that key turn thing. Once you just kind of get there, that ends up, I think a lot of the stress goes away, and then people get less defensive, and then you are able to sometimes work more quickly because you have the confidence that you know that your collaborators are not just also rubber stamping stuff for you.
Right.
And so that's the way I try to kind of work with everybody, you know, and not every member of the film gets, you know, a say over, you know, whatever, but it's like, I want my DP to be happy with what they're doing, and I want my actors to be happy with what they're doing. And generally speaking, if they're not, they'll have a good idea of a way to take it that may not even be the best thing for this original conception of the film, but it's the best thing for their involvement in the movie. And if that's the most honest thing for them, and I've made the commitment to work with them, then I have to follow that path, because like that's the process. And I just believe in that a lot.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, it's a form of like committing to partnership and also servant leadership. I mean, what you're describing, a lot of other quote unquote like business leaders or organizational leaders would describe as servant leadership. Versus this dictatorial or brigade driven approach.
And I'm just not good enough at that. Like I don't have that. I don't have the personality.
Yeah, if we were Steve Jobs, it would be like, I would just default to that.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm not Steve Jobs.
I'm not. And I, you know, I don't have that. I also don't quite have necessarily either that like clarity of vision, like or commitment to vision. Like I'm much more interested in the process, you know, and interested in the people. And I think something I've reflected on a lot in the last couple of years is like, I also think on some level, because movies were this kind of outlet and this social outlet for me, I think I did start making movies because I wanted to have friends. And I think I started to realize like that's acceptable. And it's acceptable to also prioritize the kind of like community building aspect of the filmmaking process as much as possible. So even sometimes, you know, maybe there's somebody where it's like, is their taste or is the way they're going to participate in this exactly what I wanted? Not necessarily, but I like them and we have an interesting dynamic, and that is just as valid of a reason to work with someone.
And the bond that you forge by accomplishing a mission with someone, the bond that you forge by overcoming challenges and creating something together is like no other bond of friendship. It's different than purely social friendships, but I mean, I have so many rich, unique relationships in my life that came from working with people, and you just see such a different side of people, and it can be really fun to see people's like more like practical side, or their like go-getter side, or their problem-solving side. So that rings true to me.
And I just like that. I love being in the trenches with my friends, you know. It can be really hard, but also like I think that shared sense of accomplishment is remarkable.
Your two major works, Cam and How to Blow Up a Pipeline. In Cam, as we discussed briefly, it's a woman who is a cam girl, and not to give too much away with the film, But after she sees some success on this camming platform, her identity gets stolen. And it's not clear whether it's the platform or whether there's some nefarious force. And in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, there is obviously an oil company, right, which is constructing pipelines in the in the Midwest. In both of these films, you've made business an antagonist. In the case of Cam, it's the site itself or someone with a profit motive, and in the case of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, it's the oil company or the oil infrastructure company. Tell me a little bit about this, about deploying businesses as antagonistic or villain forces in your films.
Yeah, I mean, in Faces of Death, which is finished and will hopefully come out at some point, it also has, I think, almost maybe the most explicit and aggressive, I think, articulation of that idea. I think for me, the thing is storytellers and storytelling, this has like a long root and like such an important place in like the construction of human culture and civilization, and specifically our kind of moral architecture of the world is often formed through storytelling. I still try to kind of like ultimately construct the stories that I tell around the ideas of, what is the moral architecture of the world that I see, or what are the criticisms that I have of the world that it is currently designed. And, for me, capitalism and late capitalism is the fundamental structure that is at the core of the rot of most of the problems that we have globally, be it climate disruption, be it, gentrification and the deaths of cities, be it, the genocide in Palestine. You can link all of these things in some way or another pretty quickly and easily back to kind of late capitalist structures. And I think that, I want to try to tell stories that like give people the ability to kind of tactily relate to that or understand it or express it in language that is not necessarily theoretical, but that is more based and baked in people's, emotional experience of a narrative. So, with something like Pipeline, this is a film about 8 young people that destroy an oil pipeline as an act of resistance against, the use of fossil fuels. And I think that usually when these narratives of kind of industrial sabotage or direct action are told in mainstream news media, the people that participate in these acts are like heavily demonized, dehumanized. They're kind of stripped of any kind of moral justification or even the ability to articulate the moral justification of their acts. And the acts are simply portrayed as acts of violence and terrorism. And I think for me, I was so much more interested in this notion of 8 young people who each have kind of like an emotional and philosophical appeal for self-defense behind what they're doing. And if you can kind of give people that tactily as an experience inside of a story, then now maybe they're able to like emotionally understand or intuit that, narrative in somebody who engages in that act in the actual real world. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the movie is saying, this is the truth, that these acts are or not justified, but it's presenting, 8 people who feel that way, and then allowing the audience to now kind of, go into, I think, whatever moral argument or conversation around these ideas that they might find themselves in, armed with like a counterpoint, which I think is really valuable.
You talked about like loving film and being really drawn to film, but there's clearly more to it than the storytelling and the artistry. For you, what is the role of creating social change and behavior change in your work?
I think it's really hard for me to feel like the movies themselves do anything, because I think that it goes back to that thing I was saying earlier. There's so much noise. There's so many stories. There's so much media. There's so much content. And I feel it. If you think about a movie like Fight Club and this kind of like massive social impact that movie had in ways both good and bad, or, you know, that you can criticize.
Sure.
I don't see a film that's had anywhere near that kind of social impact in the last 5-10 years. And I think a lot of that I feel in my own life. Part of it is I think the general quality of film has gone down. Part of it is that we have lost this connection to the theatrical communal experience, which does, I think, give movies their power. And part of that is that there's just so much stimulation that every individual thing has less value because, you know, there's just a lower signal to noise ratio because there's more noise. And so for me, it's like, I don't know how to do anything else professionally. I don't feel like I have any other skills, and I'm still going to try to do my best. I'm still going to try to kind of like tell stories that I feel will be productively provocative for their audience and that will, you know, concretely and materially introduce ideas into kind of the cultural discourse that I think are important, and introduce those ideas at the level of kind of entertainment and popular culture, which is not something that I necessarily see a lot of people doing, without the movie feeling too much like Eat Your Vegetables.
Yes.
That's still what I'm going to do. I don't know if I believe that it does anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, it's not that, like, the goal with How to Blow Up a Pipeline was to start a conversation. And we did. You know, we had a bunch of articles in the New York Times. There were tons of security bulletins issued about the movie. We were on Fox News. I went on CNN. And it was a really exciting moment for 3 weeks. And then it completely went away. And maybe if the movie was a better film, it would have had more cultural staying power. But I also just think that, like, we just move on very quickly from these things. So even though we had this kind of like fever pitch of provocation, it didn't really culturally take hold.
Yeah.
And again, maybe that's the film's fault. Maybe that's just the nature of how these things happen in the culture. But I certainly think that I had ambitions for the movie, for it to, I think, at least have a bit more long-term cultural purchase. And again, in certain groups, with certain people, with certain young people, I think it does. But I had obviously had greater ambitions.
Yeah.
So to me, one of the things that I try to focus on is, like, also, it's enough how I make a movie. Outside of what the film is and what the film's impact and the wider culture and these kind of like very big ambitious ideas, it's like, the one thing I can 100% control is, who am I bringing together to do what, where, why? What are the implications of that project for the film business writ large? That is material in a way that can't be taken away. And that is a kind of form of like social engineering. And those relationships do last. And also I think the experiences, I know that there were a lot of people that had experiences on cam making that movie where, like, they came up to me afterwards, and Issa in particular came up to Issa and were kind of like, thank you so much for exposing me to these ideas about sex work, about a sex workers agency. And like, I think that the people that made the movie probably had a much more profound experience because of the film than the people who watched the movie. And that's valid. That's really valid.
Yeah.
There's hundreds of people that affects. And so for me, that's something that I try to hold on to.
And the more notable you and your team become as filmmakers, and the more quote unquote like conventionally successful you become, the more people will explicitly and implicitly mimic the way that you work. And so in that way, you start to infect health and change the culture of the industry.
I would hope so.
Yes.
You know,
I think it's inevitable.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I'm very like, heartened to see what's happening with Honora. In part because I do find the way that Sean Baker works with communities to be like especially the sex work community, to be really Like the films themselves aside, I think the collaborative process that he has with actors who continue to recur in his films and who he continues to support after the movies are done, and the ways that I think there is a genuine, meaningful collaboration with the communities that he's representing, I think is amazing.
So let's go back to Pipeline. We're talking about both, but I think Pipeline is a more interesting one here. Can you talk to us about how do you actually get projects financed and distributed in order to get them made? These are not necessarily, they're more art house films than they are, quote unquote, like commercial films, right? You're not making Spider-Man 17. And I read that you crashed a party at Cannes Film Festival in order to, and met someone to secure the financing for Pipeline. So how do you actually, who invests in these films? What's your pitch to them? How do you actually go and raise the money?
Again, I'm going to bring it back to these level of like people and relationships and so with Pipeline, I think that, again, there was a moment reading that book when I was with Ariella where there was a kind of like a mutual lightning bolt moment of kind of like, there's an idea here that we can do and that we know that we can get money for because it's exciting and it's a very, very concrete idea. So from the beginning, this idea of like a heist movie, eco-terrorism, a heist movie about eco-terrorism, I think we knew would be something that would have kind of cultural penetration, and that I'm a big believer that there's this notion in both film and business that if you're going to do something, it needs to be something that everybody wants to invest in. I think the opposite is true. I think that for me, what has proved out far more effectively is something that one person's really excited about, or two people are really excited about. Because that's all it takes.
Right.
You don't need...
You can't take everybody's money.
In fact, you don't want to.
Yeah.
You want people that are really, really passionate about something. So if you have an idea that's something that people might get really, really passionate about, that's going to take you much, much further than an idea that 100 people are going to think is kind of interesting. And again, that works. So many movies are made under that model, but you're really playing the lottery, because it's really like, somebody might think, it's okay. And then their boss is like, it's okay.
Well,
and they got to make a movie
that work commercially, but they don't have the same quality of reflection or provocation that your films have.
And also, I think that those movies are working commercially less and less and less, because we are making movies for the kind of like vague audience,
right?
Instead
the average
of making,
person,
exactly.
The
but the average person doesn't exist.
Yeah,
just because like these portfolio investment, entities have justified believing that there's commerciality in these movies that are no longer commercial doesn't mean that we have to say they're commercial, because actually they're not movies for anybody. They're just the movies that these corporate interests will spend money marketing.
Right.
So that's what people go to, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that. For me, it's, with Pipeline, like Ariella and I drained our bank accounts, went to Cannes. We were like, we're going to find the money at Cannes. It was the 2021 Cannes Film Festival. It was in July instead of May. It was kind of a scaled down COVID Cannes, which was actually incredible because there was tons of access that there wouldn't have been.
Not
otherwise.
A lot of like hoi polloi and randos, it's people that kind of need to be there and really want to be there.
It was pretty intimate. There was basically like only like one or two parties a night, and like I formed a lot of like really long-term like professional friendships and collaborations at that festival that was like really amazing. But yeah, I mean, basically, like we broke into a party. I sneaked into a party that I eventually got kicked out of for having snuck into.
Yeah. But you got done what you needed to get done in between sneaking in and getting kicked out.
And there's a financier named Alex Hughes who runs a company called Spacemaker, and Ariella had been talking to him, was like, I think this is the guy. I think he's going to dig it. And then she kind of like engineered a kind of meet cute with me and him where like we bumped into each other. He's like, hi, nice to meet you. Oh, he's like, what are you doing at Cannes? Oh, I'm fundraising for this movie. Oh, what's the movie? And then I told him about the movie, and he said, that's the best pitch I've ever heard for a film. And he's like, if the script's good, I'll do it.
Wow.
And then, Spacemaker co-financed the film with another company called Lyrical. And I met Alex Black, who's the principal there, through a video game that I was developing with Issa. And,
oh, cool.
And that video game project didn't end up working out, but, I sent him the script and he really liked it. And I had kind of known from meeting him that this is the kind of thing he would really resonate with. So yeah, I mean, it's like, but again, like those were really great collaborations too. Like they were great financiers. They were great collaborators. They both made the movie materially better. So did the people at their companies.
Yeah.
You know, I think that like, but it was really about, I pitched the movie 500 times at Cannes, right? Like it wasn't like there was one conversation. I like shamelessly would talk to anybody. I kind of think of it as like I'm like sitting like down by the like Crozet, like with like a coat full of like watches, being like, hey, you wanna get one of these bad boys?
Right.
You know what I mean?
You
Like I'm
buy
like
an environmental activist film.
exactly. Like I'm like hawking my goods.
That's
and
what it takes.
I like that idea of kind of like good old fashioned like shoe leather salesmanship.
Absolutely.
And that's how we got Cam made too.
That's what I mean. You have to do that at the beginning, and I think I think the number one reason why people fail is because they're not shameless.
Yeah.
You know, they're not shameless enough. Like if you actually want to engage in sales and get to yes, you have to endure no hundreds of times.
You have to be strategically shameless.
Yes.
I think that's the big thing. You have to know when to push and know when to like also pull back, because you can overdo it very, very easily.
But most people's internal governor is to stop before the point where they're shameless enough, I would say. It's interesting because I spend a lot of time in the world of investment, and like I can tell you about like people that invest in private credit, in real estate, in like buyout private equity, in venture capital, in public equities, in bonds, right? In like land banking and agricultural. Like I know people that buy like forestry, right? If you're like, I have a forest to sell, I could probably route you to someone that would like legitimately look at that. But film investment seems like such a black box to me. And I'm not sure whether it's just not what I've been exposed to, or whether it just doesn't have the kind of like institutional like construction that these other investment industries do. But it's very rarely do I come across like film investors.
I mean, it's not a good investment.
Maybe that's why.
It's not. It's not, which is fine. I actually, and this was the way I approach thinking about this is, look, it's very hard to make money in film right now. That doesn't mean you can't. It just means that it's hard.
Yeah.
And it's very, very, very high risk, but it can also be very high reward, both from the standpoint of financial payoff, but also from the standpoint of cultural payoff, right? Joker is a great example of that. Parasite is a great example of that. Get Out is a great example of that. These are movies that like do meaningfully redefine the culture in massive ways that also have a significant payoff.
So let's talk about your next project. You touched on it earlier, but Faces of Death was a gruesome documentary from 1978 that is said to have been banned in 46 countries.
Yes, which I don't think is actually
it's
true.
It's apocryphal, but that's part of the lore.
Yes.
And it documents people's like graphic and horrific deaths in some cases. What compelled you to reimagine this and make a new version of this film?
A writing job. So Issa and I were approached to adapt Faces of Death into a feature film. So it was. I had not seen or really heard of Faces of Death consciously before. My agent called me and said, "Hey, Legendary is doing a Faces of Death remake. Are you interested?" And Issa and I both like quickly Googled it and said, "Yeah, sure, we'll take the meeting." Because it is a generational thing. Like I think that people 3-4 years older, it was a much bigger deal. On VHS, but it's like I grew up. I got my snuff film from the internet, not from VHS tape. And I think, that was kind of the starting point of our conversation at Legendary with this great exec named John Silk, who developed the project with us. John really was interested in talking to us because his perspective was like, okay, because there's no story to Faces of Death. It's basically just like a doctor being like, hey, I have all this terrible footage. Look at it. And then it's a bunch of mostly fake snuff films. There's no story. There's no narrative. So, but it's a very valuable title. It's very known. And John was kind of like, I think we have to kind of take the standpoint of like, where is Faces of Death today? And this notion of Faces of Death is on the internet and is now widely accessible. Felt like a really interesting way into a story. And, to be clear, what I mean is that Faces of Death was a really big deal in the 70s and the 80s and on VHS tape in the 90s because you couldn't get these images anywhere else.
Right.
And now you see a snuff film on your, Instagram reels while you're waiting in line for a coffee.
Oh. Luckily, the algorithm has not been serving me those. But,
Yes,
but
yes.
this is.
But it does to a lot of people. It certainly
Yeah.
does to me because I spent many years making movie about
Right.
snuff films,
Right.
But the point is that there is snuff film that we all see. Even images from Gaza that
Yeah.
pop up on social media.
Yeah.
Like that is snuff film, and that is not stuff that you would necessarily be able to see at that level of intensity, at that level of access and explicitness. Even 10, 15 years ago, if you think about the images that came out of the war in Iraq, it was not like that, even though that was certainly what was happening in Iraq. And that these are also then images that giant multinational corporations are profiting off of hand over fist is very disturbing and very interesting.
I can't wait to see your reimagination of this.
Yeah.
When we first met, we talked about how the role of raves and dance music has changed our lives. I'm curious to hear more from you. How did you discover raves, dance music, electronic music? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I grew up in the American suburbs, as I've kind of mentioned, like without many friends. I didn't really have like friends until maybe my senior year of high school. I really struggled socially at college. Like Harvard was not a good place for me. And even though I'd go to try to go to like frat parties or basement shows, like I never felt comfortable in those spaces. I never felt like I knew how to operate or how to talk to people. And a year after I graduated, I ended up in Europe for 3 weeks. I kind of like drained my savings to like go on this like trip, and I found myself in Berlin. And I had a friend who I'd randomly met in New York. I was staying on his couch. He quite found himself enmeshed in the Berlin techno scene and kind of started taking me out. And like all of a sudden I felt like somebody had kind of like just like taken a veil away from my eyes. And suddenly there was like, there were these social spaces where I felt like I wanted to dance to the music, where I could like comfortably talk to people and make friends with strangers. And, it was a kind of like, again, I fell in love with the music. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with the scene. I fell in love with the sense of freedom. In that weekend, it was kind of like my first time doing drugs, my first queer experience, my first, techno experience. And I felt so kind of just like it had such an impact on me, both in terms of like these aesthetics that I think I hadn't taken seriously before, of kind of electronic music. And, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I love this and I get this. And I'm really interested in investigating this more. But it kind of like also, I think, really ate away at a quite pretentious, I think, approach that I had to the kind of art I was interested in making. It really, I think, made me much more interested in like exploring things that were commercial and generous and poppy. Because all of a sudden it was a form of pop culture and pop music that I felt that I actually could see myself in.
Interesting.
I think that it was also, right after that trip to Berlin that I reconnected with Issa about her journey as like a sex worker. And I started learning more about that, which I think is relevant because it's one of these things where it's kind of like, I don't know if I would have been as primed to kind of really get what she was doing if I had just come from like a week of kind of feeling very like individually sexually liberated in Europe.
Wow.
And so there were just like a lot of ways that I did feel like it opened my eyes and opened me to, I think, a different way of being and to a kind of social world that was actually a possibility for me.
It's amazing to hear about how this experience was like a pressing the reset button for you, almost. Socially, you went to an entirely new context where you knew one person who was your guide, but effectively you knew no one. And you learned a new way to relate to people.
Exactly.
And a new way to be in community and a new way to enjoy yourself.
It was probably like my first time feeling like even the beginnings of a sense of social acceptance from, somebody that was like, from kind of anybody in a lot of ways.
Where do you remember which clubs you went to?
I went to my very first techno club was was called Golden Gate, which is actually still in Berlin. It's a great little, it's like a dive bar club, but of all of the clubs in Berlin, it has changed the least in the last 10 years. It's still got quite an authentic vibe, and it feels like just like a real community party there, and it's like a great little venue. But that was the first one I went to.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into the fun part.
Yes.
We have some fun. I have a surprise for you.
Oh, great.
So you had referenced a tech support or a customer support person, an operator.
Yes.
In Cam.
Yes.
And am I correct that character was Longmont Potion Castle?
It is.
And so for those of our audience that isn't familiar, I thought we could listen to a little bit.
I would love that.
Longmont Potion
I'll
Castle.
also give some context.
Please give the context while I fire up this.
Yeah. Which is basically, so I'm from Boulder, Colorado. Longmont Potion Castle is from Longmont, Colorado, which is, a neighboring city to Boulder. And basically, he is an infamous prank caller. Kind of one of the first, I think, popular prank callers. Cam was a very long and difficult editing process, and our sound designer Mike Bacuzzo was very into Longmont Potion Castle. So during lunch, we would listen to Longmont Potion Castle tapes to unwind and kind of have a little laugh. And then as a joke, we were we need somebody to play this customer service operator. And so I went to his website and as a joke submitted an application. I just submitted a thing to be hey, will you play this operator in the movie? And he emailed back and he was yeah, my car is in the shop and I need the money. And then Mike and I happened to be working in Boulder and drove out to his place in Longmont and recorded with him for an afternoon and got to meet him and hang out with him. And he's a really interesting dude. And yeah, so big fan of his work. Very influential on Tim and Eric.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can tell there's you can really, some of their weird cadences that I think that really, I believe that they came from you get the sense that these guys were listening to lots of Longmont Potion Castle in the 90s.
Totally, yeah.
Which one are you going for?
So this track we're going to start with a track called Nash.
Okay, I don't know.
In which Longmont is calling a record store.
This is my favorite, yes.
Requesting a record.
Yes.
Hi, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Super. I was looking for that that R&B single.
Who?
The R&B single. It's triple check, check, double check, triple check, check, triple double check, triple double.
You don't know what it's called?
Triple double check, check, triple double check, triple check. Double triple check, triple double check, double. It's like that.
Okay, hold on.
Otis King, I think.
Excuse me?
I think it's by Otis King.
Otis King?
Yeah.
Okay, hold
and
on.
It's like triple double flip, a couple double chip, double trip, double chip. It's like triple double flip, a couple double chip. Double chip, double trip, double chip. Double flip, a couple double. So I was wondering how late you're open to. Triple chip.
Hello?
Yeah, how late you're open?
We're open till 10.
10 p.m.
Right. Do you want me to check on that album for you?
Do you have anything by Dugan Nash?
Can I ask you what you're thinking?
This one is a bit of a longer investment, but if you haven't heard it, or for the listeners who haven't heard it, I think his ultimate masterpiece is one that's called Omniprong, but it's several minutes to really get into it, which is...
We're going to link to it in the show notes.
Okay. Do you know about this one? Omniprong, it's basically, he starts by calling a Radio Shack and asking if they have an Omniprong. As they start to answer, he calls another Radio Shack and just loops them in until he has 5 or 6 different Radio Shacks all on the same call talking to each other, but without any idea of why they're all talking to each other. And every time anyone hangs up, he'll call another Radio Shack and add them in. And these people are just don't understand what's happening. And it's amazing. I really love Omniprong, love Swamp Donkey, and love Wallet-sized wildfire is my maybe my ultimate favorite.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
We'll link to all those. So good. So epic that you had the like creative entrepreneurial instinct to be like, let's get Longmont to do this.
Yeah.
And he was in your film.
Great
Wow.
dude.
Okay. We have a segment called At Large and Off the Cuff. So
Okay.
it's more of a quick fire round.
Okay.
So it's not about length, just get the answers out there and feel free to opine or not. I ask everyone the same question to start, which is, are you glad that social media exists, or do you wish it never existed?
I wish it never existed.
Great. How is the film industry changing in ways that most people might not be aware of?
I'm not sure how much people are or are not aware of this, but I think that the biggest way that the film industry is changing is, and this is maybe obvious, but it's that, the film business in Hollywood, like many businesses, was built off of scarcity, right? Hollywood, we were the only places that could make moving images of a certain scope and scale. It required this massive industrial process to create them and to distribute them. There is zero scarcity to that now, especially with AI.
Right.
So what the business is really fundamentally reckoning with, and has been for close to a decade, is, well, then what's our business? And what you see Hollywood perpetually doing is trying to introduce artificial scarcity into the marketplace to hold on to its purchase for dear life. Artificial scarcity is IP, right? Not everybody can make a Marvel movie and distribute it. Artificial scarcity is movie stars. One of the really interesting forms of artificial scarcity are the kids of movie stars, because the business believes that it can value the children of movie stars because there's only so many of them. That's a scarce category of person. And I've had agents just call and pitch talent to me just based on, oh, well, this is X person's kid. And I'm like, that's not a qualification. But I think the business believes that it can be, because, again, you can value that person at kind of a base level already. So there's all these forms of artificial scarcity creation that exist in Hollywood. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there is such a reduction in quality, is because I think Hollywood used to have a certain sense of, we need to create a quality product that people are going to want to pay for. But the problem is that feels like it's not enough. And I think that this year in particular has been a giant rebuttal to that idea. You've had so many giant franchise films that have collapsed, and then you've had movies like Longlegs that have made more. I mean, I think Longlegs made more money than Furiosa. That's really interesting, right? And so I think Longlegs is going to make more money than Joker 2. That's a $200 million movie. Longlegs is a $10 million movie, So
$200 million budget on Joker 2? Unbelievable.
And it's not even going to crack, I think, 60 or 70 million domestic.
Unbelievable.
So, right. So it's like, the consumers are telling the business, we're not interested in this, but the business doesn't know how to value itself otherwise. And I think that this year has been a real, watershed for that.
Fascinating. Great answer, Daniel. I have a question. Everyone's a critic. I ask people to critique something. Do you love it? Do you hate it? What do you think about it? This trend of defacing art for ecological causes, cans of soup on Renaissance paintings, or things in museums. Do you think this is legitimate?
I think any act of resistance against the kind of destruction of our planet is legitimate. I think on some level it's like, let's take this moral question to its extreme. Would you trade every work of art in the Western canon for the end of the use of fossil fuels on the planet? Personally, I would. I totally would.
It's a theoretical trade.
Yeah, but if you
yes, I mean,
but if you say okay,
yes, but I think that is actually a fundamentally different question than, does one incremental destruction of a painting bring sufficient awareness?
Most of these paintings haven't been destroyed, number one.
Right.
Number two, I also think that, let's think about what museums are, right? Museums are arms of the state. They are arms, and they are, generally speaking, financed by the same... museums are used to whitewash money that by and large has contributed to, climate devastation. It's not like these things exist in a vacuum. I think that at the end of the day, if you're more upset about a painting getting souped than you are upset about the fact that the Amazon River is running dry, right? Like, that painting is probably up on that wall of that museum in part because the Amazon River is running dry. And I think that, like, to me, the fact that somebody threw soup on that painting is a legitimate act of resistance and rebellion. It doesn't necessarily, nor should it be, the only act of resistance or rebellion, but I think that it's totally legitimate. And I think that, like, this desire to kind of pearl clutch about those forms of action instead of pearl clutching against the very, very real devastation that our planet is facing is, I think, something that is worth, encouraging people to examine.
Well argued. What is one filmmaker who you follow the work of, but is still largely unknown?
He just kind of broke through. I think for a long time, my answer to this question was Tyler Taormina, who made a film called Ham on Rye that came out a few years ago and just had a movie called Christmas Eve at Miller's Point.
Well, I like film. I'm not a film buff, like a film nerd, so I didn't even heard of this guy.
Yeah,
so I think that answers.
He's in
one.
LA. There's an LA film collective called Omnis Films. That's this guy Tyler Taormina and another filmmaker Carson Lund, Mike Bosta, a few other guys, John Davies. But they all work on each other's movies. They just had 2 films at Cannes this year: Christmas Eve at Miller's Point that Tyler did, Ephus, which is a incredible movie that Carson Lund directed. It's a baseball film. These guys, I think, are demonstrating a little bit of what the future of film can be. They have a collective here. None of their movies have been made, I think, for more than $500,000. And even then, most of their movies have been made for no more than $100,000.
Wow.
And they all work on each other's movies. So, Carson shot a bunch of Tyler's films, just directed his own, and, Carson's brother production designed one, and, they all really meaningfully support each other. They've all been kind of growing together. And they're making, like, really different stuff, and it's connecting with people. And I'm excited by their movies. I'm also really excited by their process. So they would be, and the other one that I would normally say is Aaron Schimberg, who just made a film, A Different Man, that came out with Sebastian Stan and Adam Pearson. And Aaron's a brilliant filmmaker, and that's a brilliant movie.
Great. I noticed that Charlie XCX follows you on Instagram.
Yes.
Does that make you Brat?
I'm not Brat, no.
But she's in your next movie?
She's in Faces of Death, and she'll be involved in the club film as well.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
We ask everyone for one good recipe that they like to cook, ideally in cookbook level detail, so someone could recreate it at home.
The worst possible person to ask this. I'm terror. I don't cook really almost at all. I love to have friends cook for me. That's my.
But there must be something you make when forced to create your own
boxed mac and cheese, baby.
Walk us through it.
Oh God. I don't. Let me think about something better that I actually will cook. I like to make a good steak. Like,
what's your steak
butter? Recipe? Just like lots of butter, lots of garlic, lots of rosemary, lots of kind of like seasoning. But like, I really don't cook at all. I should. I just don't.
You should. I agree. That's the next chapter for you.
Yes.
Where can people find you?
On Instagram, Chrono Pictures. I wish I was on social media less, and yet, but that's probably the best way to track my whereabouts.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Daniel Goldhaber. Go watch Cam. Go watch How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And when it comes out, watch his recreation of Faces of Death.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for tuning in to At Large. Today's episode was produced by Sick Bird Productions. Our theme song is Son of Sanford by Motion Worker. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and by email at atlargeshow.com. Follow me at SWH Norton on Instagram and Twitter, and DM me about the guests you want to hear on the show.